Hi everybody, I'm Crystal Clark, part of Group 4, and I'm going to be focusing on Chapter 9, God and the Limbic System. This is a bit of a rabbit hole, so I hope you enjoy it. I wanted to start with the kindling hypothesis that Dr. Ramachandran presents, which is this idea that all connections become strengthened in these patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, and that if all connections are being strengthened, then that could create meaning for seemingly any stimulus, for any object that you have, when you're having a seizure, which he thinks maybe could explain these patients that he finds that are very hyper-religious, hyper-spiritual, and he checks this with the galvanic skin response. And so this quote is attesting to what they find in the galvanic skin response, which is, to our amazement, they found that the heightened response was only to religious words and icons, not to every connection. So this disproves the kindling hypothesis. But it does bring to question, are these circuits only spiritual? Are they activated by anything else? Where are they? So next, this brings me to some of the more current research. There was this study that was done on some Mormon population, devout Mormons, where they were presented with this sequence of images and prayer. You can see here the sequences of the experiment that they set up, and these were all done in a specific set amount of time. Each of these, quotations, prayer, spiritual reading. And so they took then brain scans before and then during when they were having peak spiritual feelings. And they also had a button to push to indicate when they were having peak spiritual feelings. And so this was the scans that they were able to get from this experiment. But overall, they found activation of the nucleus accumbens, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and different parts of the striatum. And so now I wanted to look a little bit more down the rabbit hole towards, as the study kind of indicated at the end of it, that a lot of these areas in the limbic system were the same areas of addiction and craving. So in this slide on the right is the panel I just showed you, but on the left you have a new picture of some parts of the brain that are actually awakened and lit up during addiction and craving. So kind of like the circuitry for addiction. And so some of these, you may notice, are very similar areas. And that's kind of what I wanted to point out, is especially this number 1 spot here is indicating the nucleus accumbens. And you can see that in a lot of these brain scans on the right. And you can also see, interesting, this number 6 area that's listed in red is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that is also lit up in many of these areas on the picture on the right. So I think that's really interesting that a lot of these same areas that are seemingly part of reward circuits are lighting up. And that brings me to the farthest part of the rabbit hole, the DRD4 gene. And this is a gene that codes for a limbic system receptor, and it codes specifically for a dopamine receptor, a particular D4 dopamine receptor. And that is found a lot throughout the limbic system, just where there's a lot of dopamine flowing in that area. And so it's associated with good feelings and a reward system. And mutations in this gene cause a decreased binding affinity for the receptor, And so that essentially means it becomes less sensitive and it requires more stimuli. And so this, if you put this together, dopamine binding will reinforce behaviors linked to reward or joy. And that might become an even more reinforcement if you have mutations which make your receptors less sensitive to dopamine. So this graph, let me break it down. They have this DRD4, and they have essentially part of the graph here is these, says repeat alleles and no repeat alleles. No repeat alleles being no mutation, repeat alleles being the mutation. And what they found was that people who did not have the mutation, it was about equal on regardless whether you were considered, yourself religious or non-religious, more neutral. You had about the same like pro-social or like voluntary behavior. You're volunteering for your community, that kind of thing. But interesting enough, that changed a lot if you had this mutation. It seems like then, if you were religious, there was a much greater, they say, pressure to, I guess, essentially you were more influenced to do voluntary service for your community. And so that kind of spoke to the influence of the environment and the influence the environment could have on someone depending on if you have this mutation or not. And then if you take this one step further, they found that this study looked at smokers specifically, and they found that this mutation, again, DRD4 mutations, DRD4L in here indicates people with the mutation, DRD4S indicates just the regular gene. So they found that when they presented smokers with a cue, and the cue was essentially having to light your own cigarette, your favorite brand of cigarette, without smoking it. And when you did that, people who had this mutation had a lot higher degree of craving than people without the mutation. And that included arousal, and it also included a decrease in positive affect, positive, emotion. So I thought this was even one step further, just interesting to show that this gene seems to be specifically related to craving in an addiction, but maybe even craving in a social sense, or in a religious social sense, especially when you connect it back to dopamine and a decreased sensitivity to dopamine. So here are all my references. I hope you survived that dive down the rabbit hole. Thank you very much.